Okay, to start out with today, are there any questions about what we discussed yesterday? If there are, we can start with those. If you can't think of any right now, but you remember something later, we can still talk about it then. Well, if not, we're going to go back and continue talking about evolution. And I decided that I should tell you some of my bad biology jokes because, if we were in class, I would. Um, So you guys read about the guy who lost the left side of his body in an accident. He was all right. So we were talking about some people who thought about evolution before Darwin. And before we start looking at Darwin's ideas in more detail, we're going to look at a brief comparison of how Lamarck would describe how giraffes got their long necks compared with how Darwin would describe how giraffes got their long necks. After we talk about all Darwin's ideas, the right side of this diagram will become clearer. So if we look at Lamarck, Lamarck would say that if we look at ancestral giraffes, if we go back many generations, giraffes had short necks, but their food was up high and they actually had to stretch to reach their food. And as they stretched, their necks got longer. And when they had baby giraffes, their offspring inherited their longer necks that they got from stretching to reach their food. And as this happened, generation after generation after generation, ultimately, giraffes had the long necks that we see today. So notice in Lamarck's view of how evolution proceeds, the characteristics that living organisms use are passed down to their offspring, the changes that occur in them after use. This is that idea of the inheritance of acquired characteristics that we talked about the other day. Notice Lamarck's view of nature is very nice in the sense that, there are no giraffes that are left behind, so to speak. Now let's consider Darwin's view of how giraffes would get longer necks. So if we look at ancestral giraffes, what we see is that some giraffes have relatively short necks, the giraffe on the left here. Some giraffes have longer necks. So there's variation among giraffes. The giraffes with longer necks can reach food more easily. So what does that mean? Since they can reach food more easily, they're better nourished. And because they're better nourished, that means that they might be faster runners, so they can escape predators like lions more easily. When they have babies, they can have more babies, and they can have babies that are heavier, which usually in nature indicates a better chance for survival. So if we look over time, giraffes with longer necks leave more offspring behind. So the population is more heavily concentrated with long-necked individuals. Notice there are still some giraffes with short necks around. And so there's always variation in the population. Now in their final diagram, they show giraffes with two long necks, but really one of these should be a little bit shorter than the others. That would be kind of a better description of how Darwin thinks about natural selection. So we still have giraffes today. If you would go out in nature, some people have actually done this, and measure the necks of giraffes. Every giraffe doesn't have a neck that's the same length. Of course, it turns out that we now know that giraffes don't have long necks to reach their food. They have long necks for other reasons that we'll talk about later. But most of the time, giraffes eat food that's well beyond the height that they could reach with their necks. Notice we also know today we have found fossil giraffes, and we do know that ancestral giraffes really did have, on average, shorter necks than giraffes today. So when we think about Darwin, one of the main things we want to stress is this idea of variation in the population. So let's stop looking at this screen if there are no questions, and let's go to another screen and let's think about what Darwin said about evolution. And keep in mind that today, when we talk about evolution, we call it Darwin's theory of evolution. And that's because most of the basic ideas that we accept about evolution today were actually proposed by Charles Darwin. Now, keep in mind, he was under a big handicap. At the time he came up with his ideas about evolution, we didn't really know anything about DNA being the genetic material. We didn't even know basics about how inheritance occurred. That wasn't discovered until a few years after Darwin did his work. So let's think about Darwin's theory of evolution. So Darwin was born in 1809. Now you might remember this is the same year that Lamarck published his book where he proposed his scale of nature and how evolution occurred. Darwin was born to a wealthy family in England. If you've ever heard of Wedgwood pottery, I don't know much about pottery, but apparently that's a very good, a very expensive brand. His family was related to the family that owned Wedgwood pottery. And if you were wealthy in England at the time, there were really only 3 acceptable professions. You could go to medical school and become a doctor. You could go to divinity school and become a minister in the Church of England. England had split from the Catholic Church. Remember, Henry VIII wanted to keep divorcing his wives and cutting off their heads and everything, and the Catholic Church told him he couldn't do that, so the English Church split. Or you could go into the military. And of course, if you went into the military, since you were from a rich family, you became an officer. You didn't go in as a private. So Darwin dropped out of medical school. And he had gone to medical school because when he was a kid, he always liked collecting rocks and collecting insects, and he collected plants kind of like you might have done for a class before, and, you know, press them between heavy objects to flatten them. So he always liked nature. So it seemed logical he went to medical school. But he dropped out of medical school. He didn't really like blood very much. And so he dropped out of medical school. And when he dropped out of medical school, he next went to divinity school. Now, it might seem strange if he likes nature that he would go to divinity school. But remember what we talked about the other day. At the time, a lot of people explained nature by natural theology, that by studying nature, you could learn God's mind. So this seemed a logical thing for somebody who, you know, liked collecting insects and plants and rocks. And Darwin graduated from divinity school in 1831. And what happened then was something that we kind of associate with modern times, but it happened to Darwin too. He really wasn't a very good student while he was in divinity school because he would rather be off walking through the woods collecting insects than studying. So he didn't really do that great. And in fact, he did so poorly when he graduated, he wasn't offered a job as a minister in an English church. So in 1831, he returned home to his parents. And needless to say, they were not real thrilled with this. He dropped out of medical school. He finally got a degree in divinity school, but he can't get a job. But his family is wealthy, so they pull some strings. And they get him a job on a ship called the HMS Beagle. Now, this is in 1831. So, you know, think back in history. England has lost the Revolutionary War with the United States, but England still controls Canada and Australia and a number of smaller colonies around the world. So the Beagle is supposed to go to South America, and the Beagle is going to map all the harbors in South America and the islands off the coast. And the reason that England wants to do this is if war ever breaks out, They want to know where good places to build forts would be, where they could ambush the ships of their enemies, things like that. And really, it's only supposed to take 2 years. But the Beagle is actually gone for 5 years, from 1831 until 1836. Now, we used to think that Darwin was kind of the scientific officer on the Beagle, kind of like Mr. Spock on Star Trek. But we know now that actually a lot of the reason that he was hired was to keep the captain company. Now, this might seem silly, but the captain was a member of the upper class in England. And Darwin was also a member of the upper class, coming from a wealthy family. And all the members of the crew were members of the lower class. And members of the upper class and the lower class weren't really supposed to interact. So the captain's interaction with the crew was supposed to be limited to just giving them commands. And so a lot of captains on long sea voyages basically went crazy because they had nobody to talk to. So Darwin was brought along as much as anything to keep the captain company. And kind of like medical school, Darwin discovered he didn't really like being on the ship all that much. So every time the ship got near land, Darwin went ashore. And he collected specimens and sent them back to England on other ships that the Beagle was passing. Now, when I say he collected specimens, he collected rocks. He discovered some fossils. He sent those back. He collected plants and pressed them to flatten them. He shot animals and he skinned them and sent the skins and the horns back to England. He shot birds and sent the feathers back. Now, keep in mind at this time when we look at England, well, really all European countries, England wasn't unique in this respect, but when we look at England, most people in England never traveled more than 10 miles from the spot where they were born until the day they died. So when Darwin traveled around the world and sent back all these specimens, there were a lot of exotic animals and plants and types of rocks and fossils that nobody in England had ever seen before. And so a lot of these specimens that he sent back ended up in museums. And in fact, by the time Darwin got back in 1836, he was famous for all these specimens he had sent back. Now notice, we're focusing on his theory of evolution, but he first became famous for other reasons. One of the most important visits the ship made was to some islands called the Galapagos Islands. And the Galapagos Islands are off the coast of Ecuador, one of the countries in South America. They're off the coast of Ecuador in the Pacific Ocean. And Darwin saw a couple of things that really made an impression on him. There are some large ground tortoises. And ground tortoises are basically turtles, but they don't go in the water at all. These ground tortoises can be several hundred pounds. And one of the things that Darwin noticed was that if you looked on the different islands, the population of turtles on each island, they all had slightly differently shaped shells. So they didn't look exactly alike. With a little bit of practice, you could look at the shell of a tortoise and you could tell which island it came from. And he also saw a lot of species of a type of bird called finches. And here's some pictures of the finches down below. And these finches had slightly differently shaped beaks. Some of the beaks, you look at the one down in the lower right-hand corner, this is a relatively small bird with a small beak. If you look up above it, there's a bird with a much thicker beak. If you look the second from the left in the bottom, there's a bird that's actually a cactus needle in its beak. And keep in mind that birds, not having hands, they use their beaks to pick up their food and to essentially break their food up into small pieces. Birds don't have any teeth. And so this bird holding the cactus spine, they actually use that to drill holes in trees, and kind of trees with soft bark and soft wood, but they drill holes in the trees and then they pry out insects, which is the same thing that woodpeckers do, except woodpeckers actually have a beak that allows them to do that. So Darwin saw all these different tortoises on the different islands. He saw all these different finches on the different islands. And this gave him some of his ideas about evolution that we'll talk about soon. Now, when Darwin got back to England, he published a book about the trip called The Voyage of the Beagle. And this is kind of, I guess I would describe it as how I spent my summer vacation, you know, what I did when I got out of college for the next 5 years. And The Voyage of the Beagle became a bestseller. So because of all the specimens he sent back, because of this book, he was very famous. Notice that people in that day weren't usually called biologists or geologists. They were usually called naturalists. They studied nature. And he was so famous that shortly after his return, he was elected to something called the Royal Society of London. Now, keep in mind, the Royal Society of London, I don't know why it has that name, but the Royal Society of London is not royalty. The Royal Society of London is scientists. Now, like most educated people at the time, Darwin kept a journal. And his journals have been found and read by historians. And we know from looking at his journal that all the basic ideas that he had about evolution are written down in his journal within 2 to 3 years after his return. So remember, the Beagle gets back in 1836. So by 1839, he's formulated his basic ideas about evolution. But he doesn't do anything with them. He doesn't tell anybody about them. One of his friends, who's also a biologist, tells him he should learn as much as he can about some type of organism before he starts putting down his ideas, which might have been a good piece of advice, except Darwin is a little bit of an obsessive compulsive personality. So he starts to work on some other projects. And he writes a big 4-volume set of books on the classification of barnacles. Now, if we look at barnacles, this is a magnified view of barnacles. Barnacles are small organisms. They're actually in the same group as insects and spiders. And if you look at this little slit down the middle, barnacles live in salt water. So they live in the ocean. And barnacles can grow on solid rocks. They attach themselves to these rocks with a type of glue. They can grow on wharfs or piers on the wood sticking down into the water. Barnacles can grow on the hulls of ships. And barnacles can even grow on living organisms like whales. They can attach themselves to whales and live on their skin, basically. Well, Darwin decides to write about barnacles because, remember what I said a moment ago, England still has an empire that spans the globe. So if we look at English thought, what we see is that barnacles are very important, because when you have barnacles growing on the side of a ship, they slow it down. It doesn't move through the water very well. And so this might seem trivial to us, but it's an important topic in England. Darwin also writes a very lengthy book on how orchids are pollinated by insects. And he writes a 2-volume series on how earthworms fertilize the soil when they crowd through it. So Darwin, as I say, is a little bit obsessive compulsive. And he takes this advice to learn about some groups of living organisms very seriously. Some people might have, not delved into these other groups as deeply as he did, but Darwin takes this seriously. Now, who knows if Darwin would have ever done anything with his ideas about evolution, except something happens in 1858. In 1858, he gets a letter from another Englishman named Alfred Russel Wallace. And Wallace is in the English civil service. You know, the civil service is basically people who work for the government. So, think of when you go to the driver's license facility or something like that. Wallace is stationed in Asia. He's in the area that today we would call Indonesia. It didn't really have that name back then. And Wallace writes to Darwin because Darwin is this famous naturalist from all these specimens he sent back from the book he wrote. And when Wallace, I don't know why I put his middle name here, let's say Wallace, when Wallace writes to Darwin, he has some ideas that are similar to Darwin's ideas about evolution, the ones that are in Darwin's journal back in 1839. And Wallace has already scheduled a presentation that he's going to give to the Royal Society of London. So he's going to talk about evolution. So here's this idea. Keep in mind, neither Darwin nor Wallace called it evolution. It had a different name back then. We're using the modern name. Keep in mind, in science, somebody who does something first is the person that gets credit for it. If you come along second or third, you don't get that much credit. You know, you probably all heard of Einstein's theory of relativity. You might not have heard of Richard Feynman. He's a physicist who died a few years ago, and he made some modifications to Einstein's theory of relativity. But we don't call it Feynman's theory of relativity, it's Einstein's theory of relativity. In science, the person that discovers something or does it first is the person that gets the credit. Well, Darwin has these ideas about evolution that he's had for 19 years. Wallace has really just come up with them. He's not as slow moving as Darwin is. And Wallace is going to give a talk to a scientific group, and he's going to get the credit for it. But remember what I said a little while ago. Darwin is a member of the Royal Society of London. And in fact, one of the few people that Darwin has told his ideas about evolution to is the person that gave him that advice to study one organism in detail, so he knew at least about one type of living thing. That person is also the person who organizes all the meetings of the Royal Society of London. So Darwin arranges to give a talk at the very same meeting as Wallace. So by giving a talk at the same meeting, Darwin ensures that he gets some credit too. And he not only gets some credit, he gets much more credit than Wallace. Notice that we call it Darwin's theory of evolution. We don't call it Wallace's theory of evolution or Darwin and Wallace's idea, even though Wallace's ideas are almost the same. But Wallace really did just come up with this idea. So he doesn't publish his big book about evolution for several years. And when he does publish his book, he does something that isn't acceptable in science. When Wallace publishes his book, he says, well, you know, if we look around nature, everything in nature has evolved except one thing. There's one living organism that's so different, that's so unique, it couldn't have evolved. It had to be created by God. And that, of course, is humans and the human brain. So Wallace refuses to apply his ideas about evolution to humans. And because of that, he loses a lot of credit in science. So even though most of his ideas were very similar to Darwin's, Wallace is kind of just a footnote in history. He doesn't get very much credit. On the other hand, Darwin has been thinking about this idea since 1836, and his ideas have been pretty well organized since 1839. So the very next year, in 1859, Darwin publishes what he calls his little book, which is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, and there's a lot more to the title. Really it's by means of natural selection that's important. Now keep in mind, Darwin calls this his little book, but his little book is 400 pages long. And it was probably a little bit easier to read at the time, but if you read it today, it's difficult reading for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's written in 1859, so it's about 160 years old. So English is, written differently if you go back then. But the other reason it's hard to read is, remember, I said Darwin is kind of a little bit obsessive compulsive. even though the book is about 400 pages, there's only like 10 or 12 chapters in it. There's not that many chapters. And what Darwin does, think about when you first learn to write an essay, they always tell you to, kind of give your readers an introduction to the material, cover all your points, and then sum things up. So in every chapter, Darwin kind of tells you the point he's trying to make. And that takes him maybe a page or two. And then he gives you an example. And then he gives you another example. And then he gives you another example. And he gives you another example. He gives you like 35 pages of examples. And by the time you get to about page 10 of his examples, you've already figured out what his point is going to be. And you've seen so many examples that you're ready to admit he's correct. But he just keeps piling example on example on example. And then at the end, he says, well, what do all these examples mean? Which you figured out halfway through the chapter. So that's another reason that it's hard to read, because it's so many specific examples. So let's look at what Darwin's main points were. So Darwin says, if we look at nature and living things, we can make some observations about what we see in nature. And Darwin says, one of the things we can notice is that all living things produce more offspring than can survive. Now, in Darwin's time, the thing that he knew about that reproduced the slowest was elephants. And elephants are kind of like people. Elephants typically reach sexual maturity somewhere around 15 years old, some a little bit earlier, some a little bit later. And they usually only have one calf at a time, like people usually only have one child. So Darwin said, let's think about elephants for a moment, since they're the thing that reproduces the slowest. And he said, let's look at how big the continent of Africa is. And let's look at how big an elephant is. And so now we can compare the size of an elephant to the size of Africa. Obviously, Africa's a lot bigger. But Darwin said, let's think about, suppose we start out with one female elephant. And sorry, guys, but when we talk about reproduction, we're just going to talk about females. And that's going to be something that pretty much holds steady throughout the whole class. So let's think about one female elephant. And let's assume that this female elephant lives long enough to have two female calves. Again, we don't care if she had any males. And let's assume that these two female calves grow up and have two female calves. And now let's assume that those four female calves grow up and have two calves each. Well, if you do the math, what you figure out is in a few thousand years, every square inch of Africa should be covered by elephants. Every square inch of Africa is not covered by elephants. So there's obviously more offspring being produced than can survive. Now, if you live here in Illinois, a good example of something like this is maple trees. All those little helicopters that we see coming down, those are all seeds that could grow into maple trees, but they don't. If they did, we'd all be trapped in our houses. So this was something that biologists could agree with. Okay, yeah, living organisms can produce more offspring than can survive. Now, the reason that they can't all survive is because the resources needed for survival are scarce. There's not enough food, or if you're a bird, there might not be enough places to nest in a tree. It might look to us like birds just nest anywhere in trees, but when we study different types of birds actually nest in specific areas. Some birds like to nest closer to the ground, some like to nest further away, some like to nest out towards the edge of a tree or the bush, some like to nest more in the middle. Or there might not be enough places to hide from your predators if you're something that someone else needs. Or there just might not be enough mates that you can find so that you can survive, but you can't reproduce. So So your genetics die with you. So we have a lot of individuals. We don't have enough resources for all those individuals to survive. So Darwin said, let's think about all these individuals that we have. They're all different. Now remember our giraffes with the different length necks that we talked about a moment ago. Darwin was really the first biologist who recognized the importance of what we sometimes call variation. Before Darwin, biologists thought in terms of averages. So you see this get made fun of sometimes after the United States takes a census. You'll see something like, well, the average family in the United States has 2.3 children. Well, wait a minute, nobody has 2.3 children. You might have 2, you might have 3, you might have 1, you might have 6, but nobody has 2.3. Before Darwin, biologists thought in terms of averages. And Darwin said, it's not the average that's important, it's all these differences that we see between individuals. That's the important part about looking at a population, whether it's people or elephants or finches or ground tortoises, whatever it is. And Darwin said, now let's think about these differences. And Darwin said, some of these differences, not all of them, but some of these differences are important for survival and reproduction. So think about animals like zebras. It's not always obvious, but biologists know from studying zebras that those black and white stripes that you see are actually a type of camouflage. If you see a zebra from a long distance away and you're not in a zoo, you're out in the wild, those long stripes kind of look like tall grass growing. So zebras tend to blend in with their environment. They're also important for another reason, which is with all those stripes, when a lion or a cheetah or something attacks a herd of zebras, all those stripes running in different directions at the same time make it hard for a predator to focus on one individual and hone in on that individual and successfully kill them. So we know that stripes are important in that sense. They provide camouflage. But on the other hand, what you may not realize is there are actually 3 different types of zebras, 3 different species. And if we look at these 3 different species of zebras, the stripes aren't always the same width, and there's not always the same number of stripes. So having stripes is important. Exactly how many you have or how narrow or wide they are, that doesn't seem to be super important. And you could also guess for zebras. It's probably important for a zebra to be a fast runner rather than a slow runner. If you're a fast runner, you're more likely to escape from lions and cheetahs and things that are trying to eat you for lunch. If you're slow, oh well. It's important to have strong leg bones because if you're a fast runner, but your leg bones are very thin and weak and fragile, you may snap a bone and break your leg when you're running away from a lion. And if you break your leg, it doesn't matter how fast you are then. So there's all sorts of differences that might be important. On the other hand, zebras are mammals like we are. And if we look at zebras, zebras all have 2 ears and 2 eyes. So, you know, there aren't really any differences in the number of ears or the number of eyes that are important for survival and reproduction. And then finally, Darwin said, some of these important variations are inherited, at least partly, maybe not completely. Environment could play a role. And Darwin had a lot of problems with this idea, because if you go back to 1859, when his book was published, nobody knew how inheritance occurred. You might remember last semester in 105, we talked a little bit about Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel published his paper on genetics, how inheritance occurs, in 1865, so 6 years later. And inheritance was an important part of Darwin's ideas. The 2 ideas about inheritance that were common at the time seem silly to us today, but it's good to keep in mind that they were perfectly logical at the time. So keep in mind, if we go back to 1859, nobody knows that DNA is a genetic material. Nobody knows that you have 2 alleles for each gene. Nobody really knows about how mitosis and meiosis work. And one idea of inheritance at the time was something called blending inheritance. People had figured out that males produce a fluid during reproduction. People had figured out that females produce a fluid during reproduction. So the idea of blending inheritance is, similar to if you grew up with some siblings, or maybe even if you didn't. I have several brothers, and when we were growing up, if we had, green Kool-Aid and we had, red Kool-Aid and blue Kool-Aid, you could mix 2 colors. You could mix blue and red, and you get kind of a purple color. So you get something in the middle. The red and the blue colors blend. You could mix yellow Kool-Aid and blue Kool-Aid, and you get green Kool-Aid. So the idea of blending inheritance is, okay, we know that males produce a fluid. We know that females produce a fluid. So say we're focusing on height. If we have a male who's 6 feet tall and we have a female who's 5 feet tall, they both produce fluid. So when we blend, when we mix this, their children should be about 5 feet 6 inches tall. Maybe if the male produces a lot of fluid and the female doesn't produce very much, the kids will be closer to 6 feet tall. Maybe if the female produces a lot of fluid and the male doesn't produce much, the kids will be closer to 5 feet tall. Of course, I'm guessing you probably know some families like I do where there are children and the children are taller than their mom or their dad. Or you probably know some families where the children are shorter than both of their parents. Well, that doesn't make sense if blending inheritance is how inheritance works. So there were some flaws with this idea, but at the time that Darwin was born, at the time that Darwin wrote his book, I should say, this was the main idea about inheritance that was accepted, that offspring would be somewhere in the middle of their 2 parents, that the parents' characteristics would be blended. The other common idea was something called preformationism. And again, it kind of seems silly today maybe, but you have to put it in its historical perspective. Keep in mind that in the 1800s, we were just getting to the point where all sorts of cells were being seen under a microscope. And a few people had seen them before, but biologists were now regularly looking at egg cells and sperm cells. And so preformationism was the idea, since most scientists were male, that if you just had a better microscope, you could look inside a sperm cell, and what you would see would be a little astronaut curled up in that sperm cell. And when the sperm cell got into the mother's body, that astronaut would burst out and grab on, and the placenta would be formed, and that's how pregnancy occurred. Now notice, it seems like if that astronaut is in the sperm, that really all the genetic characteristics should be things that are coming from the father, and obviously children inherit characteristics from their mother. So again, there were some problems with this idea. Notice that not only were the ideas improper in a sense, but if blending inheritance or preformationism was really how inheritance worked, then evolution could never occur. So this was a problem for Darwin because he was saying that these variations are inherited. Now, the biologists who challenged him, they couldn't necessarily explain inheritance either, but since it was part of Darwin's ideas, he had to be able to explain it. And he really couldn't explain it very well. Nobody could at the time. So it's not that long, 6 years, until Mendel published his work, and we kind of knew how inheritance occurred. Except the other thing to recall, when we talked about Mendel in 105, remember that when Mendel published his paper on genetics in 1865, nobody read it. It was ignored. It wasn't recognized as being a good explanation of genetics until the year 1900, when three separate groups of botanists studying how reproduction occurred in plants were going back through historical documents, and they found Mendel's paper from 1865, and they all recognized, hey, now that we know about meiosis, this is how eggs and sperm are made. But when Mendel published his work in 1865, even then, it wasn't recognized as being the solution to the problem of genetics. Now, Darwin said, if these observations are true, then certain conclusions are going to happen. So one of the things that Darwin said is, if we look, the organisms with certain variations, what type of variations? Well, the variations that are best suited to the local environment. And by the local environment, we mean the area where they live. The organisms with the variations best suited to the local environment are going to have the best chance to survive and reproduce. Seems pretty obvious, but keep in mind that there were actually people at the time who proposed that every generation, remember, we said in natural theology, the idea was living organisms had been created by God in the book of Genesis. Some people who believed in natural theology said that every generation, people and other living organisms deteriorated because we were getting farther and farther away from the time described in Genesis. So living organisms were becoming more imperfect. Now, notice the idea that some individuals that have certain differences, have a better chance to survive and reproduce. This is Darwin's idea of natural selection. And notice that it's nature, it's this local environment, it's where these organisms live. That's what's selecting which individuals survive and which individuals reproduce. And natural selection is really the key to Darwin's theory of evolution. And it's the key for one major reason. If we go back and we look at Buffon, remember Buffon says God produces these plans, and depending on what environment the plans are executed in, we get cheetahs versus lions versus tigers versus domestic cats. And Lamarck has this scale of nature, where on the scale of nature, living organisms might start out as worms and might work their way up to being an insect. Well, guess what? You can't test Buffon's plans in an experiment and show that they're wrong. You can't test Lamarck's ideas in an experiment and prove that they're wrong. So they're not really good scientific hypotheses. On the other hand, natural selection is easy to test in an experiment. If we think natural selection could explain how living organisms change, here's what we can do. We can take some living organisms, we can either control their environment out in nature, or we can contain them in a lab and put them in different environments and see if future generations change in different ways. And today there are thousands of experiments that have been done with natural selection. The early ones were done in a lab, but today biologists have done experiments where they've taken nets and covered certain streams so that the birds that normally dive into these streams and eat fish can't dive in anymore. And they've compared how the fish in a stream where they're protected from birds evolve in neighboring streams where the same types of fish aren't protected from birds. So in different local environments, you can get different changes. And notice that even though Darwin was the first person to apply this to nature, in a sense, it wasn't really an original idea. Darwin got this from something called artificial selection, which is people deciding which individuals survive and reproduce. And you can see some good examples of this if you think of all the different breeds of dog that we have. All the breeds of dog evolved from the same ancestral population of wolves. But Chihuahuas look a lot different than St. Bernards or German Shepherds. How? Because people wanted dogs with certain characteristics. So when they chose who survived and who they allowed to breed, what type of male and what type of female, they, over a long period of time, developed different breeds. When we look at dogs today, there are some breeds like Yorkshire Terriers. Yorkshire is one of the areas in England. It's kind of like a state, but Yorkshire Terriers were actually bred to be small dogs that would fit into coal miners' pockets. And the idea was that coal miners would take them down into the coal mines when they went down. And because they were small, Yorkshire Terriers could fit through small spaces, and they could kill rats. They could get into small holes. St. Bernards really were bred as rescue dogs to be used in the Alps. They don't really carry around a barrel of whiskey like some of the cartoons show, but so different dogs were bred for different purposes. So how do you do this? You choose the parents. So, imagine that you wanted to do this with people. Suppose you wanted to get taller basketball players. You could take males who are very tall and have them have babies with females who are very tall. Now, all their kids wouldn't be tall. There would still be some variation, but on average, you could produce taller people if that's what you were trying to do. So in essence, that was what was done with all the breeds of dogs. Darwin really knew more about pigeons than dogs. When we think of pigeons, we think of the pigeons that you see on the street if you go down, in most cities downtown, like Chicago. But back at the time, keep in mind, 1859, nobody's got a cell phone, nobody's got a landline, the telegraph hasn't even been invented. So a lot of messages are sent by carrier pigeons. And there are actually a lot of different breeds of pigeons, just like today, we see a lot of different breeds of dogs. So Darwin got this idea of natural selection from what people did with artificial selection. So it wasn't completely an original thought, but Darwin was smart enough to apply this to what was happening in nature. So we have natural selection going on. We have all these individuals in the environment. There's not enough resources, whether it's food, nesting places, locations to hide from predators, whatever. There's not enough resources to go around. So what's going to happen? Well, Darwin says the result of this competition for scarce resources is always going to be the same in a sense. The next generation is going to be different than the previous generation. Why? Because if we look at everybody in the previous generation, not everybody survived. If we look at the ones who did survive, not everybody mated successfully. So the next generation is going to be formed by the contributions of only some of the individuals in the previous generation. And Darwin called this idea descent with modification. The descendants are modified, they look different from the parents. And this change is what we call evolution now. Notice that this change was not proposed by biologists, it was proposed by a philosopher, Herbert Spencer. And the reason it wasn't used by biologists is if we would go back to this time period, evolution had a different meaning in biology. Evolution was referred to how the fertilized egg developed after the sperm had fertilized it. So Darwin never really used the word evolution, but when the philosopher Herbert Spencer read Darwin's book, he decided to call it evolution, and I'm not sure why, but that name stuck. Now, notice that one of the problems that people had immediately with Darwin's ideas is Darwin didn't say there's any progress or any improvement in evolution. All he talked about was adaptation to the local environment. So if you have a local environment where food is scarce, what happens? Well, the organisms that survive might be organisms that have a better sense of smell so that they can find food first. Or it might be organisms that have a very slow metabolism so that they don't need as many calories to survive. But you're not necessarily getting better in any overall sense of the word. And today we can actually see a lot of examples of this. There's one bird called the spotted owl. And the spotted owl lives in the Pacific Northwest area of the United States. And if we look at the spotted owl is very well adapted to what are called old growth forests. The spotted owl lives in forests where many of the trees are older than 80 years old. And it's very good at surviving and reproducing in those areas. But today, the spotted owl is on the verge of extinction because there's a problem. Can anybody guess what the problem is if you're a bird that's adapted to live in trees that are older than 80 years old, usually? Well, as trees get older, they usually get bigger. And the biggest trees are the ones that are best for getting lumber from. So the problem for the spotted owl is it's very good at surviving in trees that are older than 80 years, but guess what? Somebody's cutting down all those trees, people, us. So there are fewer and fewer environments where they can survive and reproduce well. So even though they're very well adapted to one particular environment, that environment is disappearing. Now notice that's an environment where humans are causing the disappearance. But if we look at the history of the Earth, over the history of the Earth, certain environments have increased while other environments have decreased. So that's something that could happen in nature. It doesn't necessarily have to be used to just human interference. So we don't want to think that. A lot of what's happening today is due to human interference. So the next generation is different than the previous one. And then finally, there's one other major conclusion that Darwin drew. He said, if we have one group, one population of organisms, and it's split into two subpopulations, and these two subpopulations live in different environments. Well, remember, the local environment is what affects how something changes, how it evolves. Darwin said our two subpopulations are going to descend with different modifications, or they're going to evolve differently. And if they change enough, they can change so much that they become completely different species. Now, notice we see lots of examples of how one group of organisms can get split into subpopulations. We see it happening in nature all the time. For instance, if you go back to the area of Indonesia in the 1800s, there was an island called Krakatoa. And on Krakatoa, there was a large volcano in the middle of the island. And Krakatoa erupted. And when Krakatoa erupted, it erupted with such force that the area of the island where the volcano was sank into the ocean. And so there's not an island of Krakatoa today. There's North Krakatoa and South Krakatoa. And between the two islands, there's a channel of the ocean. Well, there were small animals like mice on the islands. And when it was all one island, the mice could mix with each other very easily. A mouse from the south side of the island could, propose to a mouse from the north side of the island. Now that there's a channel of ocean between them, the mice from the two islands can't mix very easily. We do have evidence that some mice sometimes are sitting on a branch and the branch falls into the ocean and they might drift from one island to another. But in general, there's much less mixing than there was in the past. So if the environments on these two islands are different enough, we could end up with two different types of mice. So notice this suggests that if we look at living organisms and we think of it, remember the other day we said you could think of the tree of life as being more like a bush that spreads out. So this suggests that if you go back in time, if you take two related species that have split apart from each other, and we go back to when they were the same before they had split, if we keep doing this over and over again, ultimately, all living organisms are related. They all have a common ancestor if we go back far enough. And remember the other day, we said one of the things that evolution does is evolution explains not just the diversity of living organisms, that's this kind of branching that we're talking about in C, but if we think about C as being a video of how we got all the different species of living things that are here today, if we think of it as a movie and we rewind that movie back to the beginning, it also explains the unity of life, why all living organisms have DNA as their genetic material, why they all use ATP as their chemical source of energy. So when we look at evolution from this perspective, it's a very important idea when we're thinking about biology. Now notice a lot of people did not agree with Darwin's ideas. I don't want to give you the impression that his ideas were completely accepted. But when Darwin's book was published, now most of you are too young probably to remember, but you might recall when the Harry Potter books came out, when the Harry Potter books went to the stores, people pre-ordered them. People stood in line. And when they got to the stores, pretty much every copy was sold out. Now, there were a lot less copies of Darwin's book printed than the Harry Potter books, but Darwin's book sold out immediately. And so whether you were a biologist and you agreed with Darwin, or whether you were a biologist and you disagreed with Darwin, everybody studying biology immediately had to think about evolution when they were doing their studies. So he had an immediate impact on the study of biology. And again, you can contrast that with Gregor Mendel, who came up with our basic explanations of how inheritance occurs that are still accepted today. But he published his paper in 1865, and nobody really recognized its importance until the year 1900, 35 years later, when unfortunately Gregor Mendel was dead, so he never lived to see his work accepted. So these are Darwin's basic ideas. Now, when we look at evolution, we can look at evolution from two different perspectives. We can look at evolution just in terms of what's happening to some allele in the population. Or we can look at evolution from a larger perspective. And so we're first going to look at how evolution affects the alleles in a population. So remember when we talked about alleles back in Biology 105, you could talk about the allele for normal skin pigmentation or the allele for albinism. Remember, alleles are basically the alternate versions of a gene. So when we come back tomorrow, we're going to look at that. But today we're going to have a short class because we haven't quite gotten to the point where we can do any activities, and I don't really want to force you to listen to 3 hours of lecture. So think about Darwin, check and see if you can see all the information online. So we will talk about the beginning of our discussion on microevolution on Friday. And then I'll remind you again on Friday, but remember that there is no class on Monday for Martin Luther King Day. So after Friday, we won't meet again until Wednesday of next week. So enjoy the rest of the day. Are there any questions about these notes before we leave them and I stop screen sharing?
No.
If there are any questions, you can go ahead and go. If you have anything you can think of, either about these notes or the one we talked about the day before, stick around and ask me some questions. Or whatever else you can think of to ask questions about.
I have a question. Did you read the book by Charles Darwin?
Yes, unfortunately, I have to say.
Oh, I was just wondering.
Yeah, I guess it was good because it's so important historically, but it was not a fun book to read. Are there any other questions or comments?
Thank you for the lesson today.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming in. I'll go ahead and let you go if there are no more questions.